Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, good evening. My name is Esther Peters. I am the Associate Director for the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago, and I'm excited to welcome everyone to tonight's Series of Voices with Olga Livshin. Series of Voices is an author-centered series of readings and conversations on books from or about Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Our long-term partner for this series is the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, the first not-for-profit bookstores whose mission is bookselling. Although the stores remain closed to the public, they are fulfilling orders and supporting book sales for virtual events like this one through their website, semcoop.com. And when you place your order, you can choose from shipping, delivery to local area codes, or curbside pickup. You can find information about upcoming events in this series and other events at semcoop.com and at the series website, and you can find that information in the chat box below. While tonight is our last series of voices for winter quarter, we will be back with more events in this series in spring. We'll have an event with Katarzyna Tuchkova, a Czech novelist, about her recently translated novel Goethe. Chad Bryant will be discussing his forthcoming book, Prague, Belonging in the Modern City. And University of Chicago's own Faith Hillis will be discussing her forthcoming book, Utopia's Discontents, Russian Immigrants and the Quest for Freedom, 1830s to 1930s. Tonight, we are excited to welcome Olga Livshin, who grew up in Odessa and Moscow and came to the United States with her family as a teenager. She holds a PhD in Slavic Languages and Literature and taught Russian language and literature at the university level full-time before switching to teaching teenagers world literature and creative writing. Her poems, translations, and essays are published in the Kenyon Review, Poetry International, Mad Hatter's Review, and other journals. She will be joined in conversation this evening by Eleanor Gilbert, Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago. Her first book, To See Paris and Die, The Soviet Lives of Western Culture, was awarded the 2020 Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies. And two last notes before I turn the evening over to Eleanor and Olga. We will be giving away up to 10 copies of Olga's book, A Life Replaced, to interested parties. If you would like to be eligible, please introduce yourself with your name and email in the chat box. That would be very helpful. And also, there will be time for questions at the end of the event. The Q&A box is also open and ready to go right now. You can put your question in at any time. And if you see a question you think is very interesting, you can click the thumbs up button to upvote it so we know that more people are interested in hearing an answer to that question. And with that, I want to welcome Olga and Eleanor, and thank you both for joining us this evening.
So thank you, Esther, for this lovely introduction. I urge everybody to put their names in chat and claim their copy of the book, because the book does many things. It speaks to our present moment, but also well beyond it. It speaks of universal childhood, but also links it to politics. It speaks of worlds lost and of ways we rebuild them or build them anew. And I think it speaks to the immigrant in every one of us, no matter how good our English may be. So put your names in chat and claim your copy as soon as possible. So I thought we could start, Ola, with a few words about how and when you came to write poetry, and whether you started writing poetry here in the United States, or whether it's something you discovered for yourself in the Soviet Union, and how you knew that this is poetry, and poetry is the best way to express what you wanted to say.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the kind introduction to Esther, and thank you so much for the conversation, and what promises to be a really lovely discussion, Eleanor. The seminary co-op is one of my very favorite bookstores on earth, and it's such a delight to be virtually here. I also am very fond of Eleonora's work, and so it's wonderful to be in touch. So in terms of poetry, my father was a writer. He was a humor writer and stand-up comedian and script writer, and he wrote several works of fiction, mostly short novels or novellas, depending on how you interpret them. And I was born in Odessa, and in our many wonderful aimless wanderings around the center of the city, looking at its magnificent opera house that resembles something from Vienna or Rome, looking at gargoyles and columns and statues, and my father quizzing me routinely on what kind of column is that? Ionic? And I could never tell. Somewhere around the age of 5 or 6, we started writing poems together, and eventually I started writing them in Russian. And my amazing contributions at 5 years old to the corpus of poetry about fall. Not the first, and I'm sure not the last, but I think poetry, as opposed to other genres, opens up doors that are not straight ahead of us, but rather to the side. So on that particular day when I wrote the little poem about fall, I discovered the wonders of personification. So in my 5-year-old interpretation, this fall, how have you been, fall, and fall answers. Осень нагулялась, в листьях навалялась. So autumn has walked around and she rolled around in leaves, because at 5 years old, that is what autumn does. And, I kind of never got over the wonders of kind of that sideways jump in metaphor and personification and allegory since, and it's still my favorite form of expression.
And then you switched to English.
I did.
Right when you arrived, or and how did that process happen, and how did English become your language of poetry?
Yeah, so it felt as if everybody in the 80s was emigrating. I don't know if you remember that period in Odessa, when a lot of people were, it felt as if my childhood was sort of steadily leaving. And because of that, in the cities that I inhabited, you know, Jewish folks were fleeing to either the United States or Canada, in some rare cases, but mostly United States and some to Israel. So folks were learning English, and along the way, some of my friends remember us on the beach hanging out and translating Akhmatova for fun. So English was the kind of fun one has when translating tragic poetry on the shores of the Black Sea. But my family is just, you know, it's a humor writer and a musician, and they always valued a certain kind of joy and playfulness in Akhmatova that I think is not always obvious to folks, right? She's a tragic poetess. She's a writer that wrote Requiem, a poetic witness to Stalinism. We know those roles, but there's also an amazingly wonderful kind of poetic daring that I guess as an adult I associate with modernism. And there was just a lot of kind of playing with language. What would that image look like? What would that image look like? Along with Mandelstam being quoted in Russian and my mother and I trying to translate it. So when we landed here, it seemed natural that I would try to tinker with that and imagine what is the equivalent. Usually there isn't one, which to me opens up lots of possibilities rather than kind of shut them down. And it means that things are creative and open, and those are good things in my mind. So the next step, I guess, I just started writing in English. At one point we went back to Russian, and I was doing research on my dissertation and becoming a Slavist. And it no longer felt like home for me for mysterious reasons. I know that's not the case for everyone who goes back. It didn't feel like home to me, and the poetry still felt like home, but the society has moved on and I've moved on in slightly different directions. And so English works well for me.
Actually, I meant to ask that question later, but maybe I should now, as you mentioned, going back and forth. And that is, you know, the generations of Russian poets and Russian writers in diaspora, in exile, thought about language and Russian language and poetry imagine Russian language and poetry as perhaps the last home or the last refuge or the last place where Russia resides. And of course, most of them, and they left for us some sort of exemplars of what being a poet in exile means. In those times, of course, they couldn't return, but now we can. And I was wondering if that geopolitical factor of open borders has done anything to influence what being a poet in exile means today, as opposed to the 1930s or the 1950s or the 1970s. The fact that we can physically go back, although we cannot re-enter the place of childhood, the fact that we can actually physically go back, has that made a difference, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's interesting to see how these things unfold, because it's a very double-edged sword. So I think for somebody like yourself or like me about 10 years ago, who, I used to go back fairly regularly. Yes, it is possible to travel back. And yes, it is possible to travel instantly back by reading, for example, a wonderful writer like Maria Stepanova on social media as she posts new works, and to find out about their upcoming books and to see images of all these streets where one used to walk. There's something very magical and immediately gratifying about that. And I have poems in the current book that discuss that. So on the other hand, whenever we can access something, I think we ask ourselves the question of what are we accessing? So my whole family has left the country where we were born, has become many countries. And two of the countries that I'm from are currently in a war, in a frozen conflict. The cities where I grew up have been majorly dismantled and remodeled, in some ways for the better, in some ways. Yeah, people disagree about that, but rebuilt, certainly. So it's not ruins per se, but it's just a very different living place. For example, when I go back to Odessa, we went, my husband and I, about 10 years ago, and discovered that the dacha, our summer house where I ran madly with my friends, has become part of a seaside villa complex. So it's like one is revisiting the signifier, right, without the signified. And yet, one goes back to that Proustian place, right? That childhood, the mudland. How do we do that? So we can do that in memory, we can do that in dreams, and poetry lends itself very well to both. So that's where some of the fantasy journeys in the book take place. And in a kind of speculative or science fictional poetry. So in a slightly goofy poem called Kidnapped Akhmatova, I imagine taking our poetic mother to Russia of the 1990s when I lived. An interesting and very exciting period for Russia in a kind of time travel. Or going back to St. Petersburg and Odessa in another poem, and imagining the addressee first, as a loved one, as a child, as a stranger that one wants to take back. These desperate kind of frantic journeys in my head. There's a lot of anxiety but also a lot of imagination there. And in the book, it was such a wonderful way to kind of heal myself through those kind of generative exercises. And what if the uncombinable can be combined, right? What if we could?
Speaking of that poem, it's a really wonderful, and the rest was, for me, at least because of its sort of irreverence and because of the playfulness that you mentioned earlier. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how about your relationship. I mean, it's too difficult of a thing to contemplate, having kind of a relationship with Akhmatova, but obviously you do in so many pages, right? How do you stay with her? How do you part from her? How do you escape her? Is she escapable altogether? I mean, there are so many poems in which you respond to her, and I wonder, while also translating, and I wonder how you do that. Do you first translate and then respond to her? Do you translate the poems to which you first respond in your own poetry? Sort of, how do you work with her?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there are a couple of answers to that. And for folks who are translating, I think we are used to wearing many hats and to have usually several different connections to the work. So, we can make up little, kind of conspiracy theories in our heads, these sort of like myths about how one belongs to another poet or is connected to them. I did not like this poet at all until graduate school, because everyone in my family looks like her. Here, I will do the profile. I have a nice little hump on my nose like Akhmatova, and my nickname in college, which I could not escape, was Akhmatova, especially when I wore all black and wrote much poetry. And then I began to really feel this poet. And, genetically, there's kind of a cultural memory. So Akhmatova, Mandelstam, and other modernist poets of the Russian Silver Age were, essentially banned until the 1960s when my parents came of age. And you write so eloquently in your book about all this cool, amazing reading that was published both in translation and in memory, rememory, reconnection to that beautiful cultural heritage, such as my mother was always quoting either Akhmatova, Tsvetaeva, Mandelstam. So she was a household name. But, one wants to do one's own thing. And I grew up also, you have to remember, in the home of the humor writer who was always on, right? So the jokes, we called it kukushka papa shutit, like a cuckoo clock where dad is joking. And now that we have a concept of dad jokes, I feel, as they say, seen. But, a lot of irreverence and kind of, I didn't want to be that serious. And then I discovered this sort of immense strength, like a reservoir of steel inside this person. And I said, oh my gosh, this is gorgeous. The way that I read her is similar to what Dmitry Bykov says about her, which is that many, many lyric poems in the European tradition begin with the words I or you, the love object or the pronoun from ourselves, first person. So many of Akhmatova's poems begin with no. No, she says to Stalin's repressions. No, she says to her whole generation of friends immigrating. No, she says to heterosexuality, to marital expectations, to convention as a young person, less so later on, and in some ways more so as she writes these grand poems. And that capacity to say no to everything, it's like a red thread in the Russian tradition, which I do really, identify with, for better or for worse, even though I write in English. So Brodsky was famously quoted when speaking to one of his graduate students, and they met at a conference, and the student was saying, oh, it's difficult to write poetry, this or that, I don't have a sense of belonging. And Brodsky just turned this with this grand gesture, showed him that Marriott or whatever generic hotel they were in, and said, but with poetry, you can say no to all of this. And I don't know exactly what was on Brodsky's mind that day, but to have that power of standing apart and protesting in one's own way is quite amazing. And it got me through a lot of life. And so I do admire Akhmatova. I came closest to her when I was teaching a seminar on her for a writer's workshop. And that led me to, reading her biography and reading Lydia Tchaikovskaya's writings about her diary from that time. And I then there was kind of that third layer. I discovered what was behind the steely exterior of that strong woman and the vulnerability inside. And that's kind of where I came upon this sort of collaboration. By translating her, one always gets very, very close. Although, as she would say in one of her poems, there is still that line, right? I wanted to collaborate. I wanted to understand. And you said, what is your relationship to Akhmatova? In a way, I think, this voice is very charming, the Akhmatova voice, from beyond the grave. It's kind of a known phenomenon. She charms. We are in a relationship, many of us, with her. So I wanted to understand, and then I wanted to help, as silly as that sounds. So, a poem like Kidnapped Akhmatova imagines her dead and no longer being able to speak for herself. How do we resurrect that? And how do we help those situations? What is it that voice is calling upon us to do? And magical thinking, allegorical thinking, allowed me kind of to ease into that and to imagine the journey that one could take. So that vulnerability was kind of that third layer. Yeah.
And it's difficult to deal with people like her for many reasons, but because we all carry the cultural memory, and it's difficult to make that cultural memory individualized, because it's a baggage we inherit.
Is it?
And I think it's true for so many reading and writing people of Russian speakers in the first generation. But it's a figure that's difficult to escape, and it's difficult to parse out what's yours and what you inherit from the from all the books that you've read about her, and from all the inheritances and all the cultural baggage that's given to you, as it were, together with Russian.
I agree, and it's such a weight, and it's such a tragic weight, and it's a weight of generational trauma in a sense, as well as cultural trauma, witness to trauma. I think what helped me a lot was Elaine Feinstein's writing about her, that biography, that kind of talks through the turmoil and often bafflement, confusion, kind of helplessness that accompanied her everyday life. So, I think that, that kind of relationship speaks of kind of understanding and kind of identifying this human that, despite what happened to her, was able to, with some posturing, yes, with magnificent shawls and much arrogance, to write these poems. And I think the weight that she swathed herself in with the shawls and the posturing, that's a kind of armor that a lot of us wear. We wear these very heavy iron masks for any number of roles in society. Who is behind the mask? We can't get completely into it, but it's worth trying, and it's worth understanding, why did she need to wear the armor? What was it what purpose did that serve? As opposed to, some of the more postmodern critics, you have your Akhmatova haters, you have your Akhmatova exploders, you have your Akhmatova ironists, right? That's not like my hangout. That's not what I do. That never worked for me, Goluboya Sala, Sorokin. But it's, there's certainly posturing within, but within that, one finds something. Yeah. Why do you think it's difficult for so many of us? Is it just ego, that her ego, our strong sort of voice that presides over it? Or are there other qualities?
My sense, at least for me, it's difficult to parse out what's mine and what's everybody else's, and what's the accepted wisdom, and what's the cultural baggage, and what is my individual experience, because it's some of these merge, and we are part of a greater whole, much as we like to imagine ourselves as wholly unique, and our readings of poetry as wholly unique. But I do wonder about my readings of poetry, because quite a lot of it is indebted to, I find sort of bits of accepted wisdom in my own thoughts. And it's hard to parse out what's mine and what belongs to the collective imagination.
Must one parse it out? I think that's the question.
Maybe not.
Well, it's a question of, so I teach children who are kind of coming of age or about to begin that process, sort of on the cusp of puberty and sort of into teenage years. When the bio was written, it was teenagers, but now sort of, so I'm seeing them emerge into that. And they absolutely need that. And there's an interesting tension between self and belonging that is inside all of us. I think what's very difficult about living in our country here in the United States is the constant emphasis on claiming territory. And I see it in academia and in the business world, but just in terms of human interactions, stranger to stranger, what is your thing? What do you own? Or what do you inhabit? And I think that, that exists across cultures, but here there's such an emphasis on entrepreneurial thinking, kind of what is it that you're going to do individually to leave your mark, versus some of the cultures where folks, and again, that's not all of our culture, but there is that sort of strong mainstream. But then when you look, I think immigrants and children of immigrants and grandchildren who are, privy to the languages or at least cultures of their grandparents have a kind of rootedness that balances that out and brings in a sense of meaning, connection, love, and honestly normalcy that I think is really important. And I also find that rootedness in certain Native American voices like Joy Harjo. I find it in Black poets of the Konfikonim collective, right, who are exploring their heritage and in the larger sense of like the Pan-African culture of trying to seek those roots, which were also interrupted through the generational trauma, but through poetry or through performance, re-envisioning what that may have been like, which seems like a very valiant effort because it is actually very hard. And one has to invent, to fill in the gaps. And I see, and so I find that those are the voices that I kind of connect with and love because they are part of something and they are often richer, right? They have that imprint of genre or oral tradition or other languages, and they're much more layered that way, to my eye.
You just, so much of the book and so much of what we've been talking about today has been about generations, and that word has come up several times this evening. And the book speaks very poignantly and actually quite recognizably, at least to this reader, speaks of childhood and connects it to other generations and other childhoods. And so I wonder if you could talk about, and of course you're not only addressing your parents and their generation or these great poets in their generation, but you're addressing in so many of these poems, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, you're addressing your own son. And I wonder how having that addressee reconfigure childhood for you, or how you connect his childhood here through this interruption to your own, or the children you teach creative writing to your own childhood.
Yeah, that's a hard question because I'm so close to the subject. I pack the subject's lunch.
Yeah.
But one thing that Lev Friedman, who I think is in the audience now, but who wrote a review of this book for Reading and Translation, one thing he remarked is that childhood is associated in this book with a sense of peace. And so the speaker herself, I don't know, you can probably hear him playing the piano in the background, just right on cue. That's Nathan. So I think the speaker does a lot of journeying and a lot of shuttling between cultures and a lot of sort of frantic seeking of peace, of space. And she doesn't entirely find her home. And I think that's okay. I don't think that for some of us I don't think that we should like necessarily impose that sense on us, because home right now is where war is for some of us, for example. And home for the past 4 years was just watching really torturous news. And I don't want to ignore that. And, the people who elected President Trump they still live in this country and they would have elected him again. So in the midst of all of that, children are refuge, simply put, in all poems except for one where I talk about gun violence in school, God help us all. But it really is, there's an immense mystery about what brings about that peace. And I don't feel qualified enough to talk about that because I'm really close to that subject. But that's also something I really feel with the kids that I teach, is there's this sort of, it's probably biological or physiological, there's this certainty about the future. I don't want to even say hope, tangible certainty of peace. And I may be projecting a lot here, and this may not be true, but this is just how it feels.
Because his questions or his imaginary, or his imagination of your childhood? Has that influenced how you see?
Again, it's really hard to compare. We are very similar, he and I. And he has his own struggles, and I have mine. And so it's, he's great. I'm trying to keep up with my ancestors, my parents and the others who brought me up, who, trying to encourage him to be creative and open-minded.
And play the piano.
Play the piano or else. That's his babushka, my mom. So, I'm hoping that we're doing right by him, but, it's dawning upon me that the world is not the nicest place, probably never has been. And it's difficult. It's difficult to think about the struggles that his generation and then, specific personal struggles will be facing them. So I think that one thing that is relevant to this discussion is that, my parents brought me here. Your parents brought you here. We were both 14 when we landed. There was sort of an assumption that things are just going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. I think people create a utopia in their heads about the United States, and they continue to hold on, in some cases, to this utopia despite evidence to the contrary. And that's really hard to watch. But it's also sometimes I fall for it, and I think, well, he's not going to have struggles with anti-Semitism here. Check. The last 4 years showed that that may not be the case. Better than in the Soviet Union, but okay. But that, his peers who are Black will have horrible problems that are worse than the problems that I grew up with. How do we bring up a child here? What is he going to do about it? We talk about it a lot. And I think that it's not a utopia, and it's an immensely difficult place, and it's difficult like any place for people who are a little different. He's definitely growing up to be a little bit studious and a little bit literary, so that helps us all.
And so is this sort of in the in your title of Life Replaced, is it the generations that you have in mind? Is it the poets that you're in dialogue with, that kind of the replacement? Is it the immigrant experience? Sort of how do you understand the replacement of life that you borrow from from another poet,
Right.
but make your own and elevate to a title that connects all of these pieces?
Yeah, so the title comes from a phrase in one of the poems by Akhmatova that I translated. And in her case, she was referring to some difficult events in her life that turned her life in a very different direction following the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the many, many decades that followed with their respective very turbulent phenomena. When I think about the life that, we all have these, forks in the road, one of my forks in the road would have been, if I stayed. That's always interesting to contemplate. And another fork would have been if I stayed in my profession, where I was teaching Russian language and culture, sometimes literature. Now, how would that go? And I think we all have these forks in the road. The fork in the road with changing countries, which is not a choice that Akhmatova made, but that was made for her following the revolution, where she came from impoverished aristocracy, right? Things would have possibly been a bit different for her. She was basically homeless, and, in evacuation, just, famine, losing everybody she knew and loved almost, losing, the capacity of her son. We can list all these very tragic events. I think when, obviously my life is much, much more fortunate. But I think that with immigration, like with any kind of migration, there is a loss and a substitution. So there is a replacement that occurs, obviously, but it's not a currency for currency exchange, right? So Pushkin does not easily get replaced with Derrida or with hip hop or with or with Thoreau, who I adore and talk to in my book. It's not the same thing. It's similar because the weight of Thoreau is kind of there, and yes, we must live in Walden and speak to nature, and there's such sort of romanticism, but it's not as big of a weight, you know. It's just a very different cultural situation. So what we get in return, we get wonderful things. We get peace and shelter, those of us who are lucky enough to be white and, you know, yeah, who are lucky enough, you know, not to have been the victims of anti-Semitism in the last few years. And before, those of us who are lucky enough, the cost to have assimilated and to not have as much of an accent, right? There's sort of casual, just as there's casual racism, there is casual nativism. And you and I know that because, you know, we both have parents who speak English with an accent. And there's a reason why people try to congregate in their own neighborhoods, in the Russian-speaking neighborhoods, because it's tough. I had, you know, a professor make fun of my accent incessantly in an English class in college. There is a reason why I didn't pursue an MFA, because the difference was just, there are certain kinds of stories that are not to be told. There are certain kinds of poems that are not to be written. There are certain kinds of aesthetics. We don't do this. Yes, you must have a title for your poems. You know, that's okay. 20th century Russian poetry dispensed with that for the following reason. That's not our tradition, Russian. So, you know, what did I do? I got my PhD in Russian stuff. So, you know, it's hard. And so, you know, no matter how we sort of like, for example, you and I drifted back to graduate school to study that home. Again, that's then the home of academia, right? It's a slightly different thing than the dacha. So those replacements, you know, it is a replacement.
Same, actually. Academia and dacha are very much the same.
I'm glad that
an escape from, as Brodsky would say, from all this.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
A way to say no to all this, and very similar social havens.
Yeah. Yeah, and so a lot of it probably depends on who one is and, you know, what one ends up doing, and how sensitive one is to all this stuff, right? So, yeah. So, but the replacement, you know, at the basic level, I think that when people move, there is a kind of disappearance that happens. And here there's a shadow of a title by Gandelsman, Vladimir Gandelsman, the other poet that I'm in a relationship with in this book by translating and writing towards him. He has a book called Исчезновение, which is just a beautiful, beautiful Russian word. Love it. Disappearance. And this sort of quasi-Buddhist language of a sort of emptiness and imagining oneself as a variety of emptiness. We can also probably trace that back to, you know, Brodsky, who was very fascinated with his own disappearance. I'm this dot that's speaking in front of you in the lecture hall, he says in one of the poems. But to me, you know, I've moved many, many times, both for immigration and because of the vicissitudes of the academic job market. And every time, you know, you do get a replacement, which is wonderful. But it's like getting a replacement part of something, right? It's not the original object. And there are friends that, you know, I miss deeply in those places. And there's just something very eerie about having been in a place and then not being part of that community, not being part of that landscape. What remains? It's fascinating. So it's kind of a question of verging on metaphysics, I guess. What is that shadow? Is there a shadow?
One of the things that seems to remain in your book is the Russian language, and I was wondering if you could comment on the function of, you know, there are a number of poems that have Russian inserts. Now that there's a poem by Gandelsman that has English inserts, and that's sort of there is a whole tradition of Russian American writing with the, you know, with kind of
oh yeah,
inserting English words in various distorted ways as spoken by immigrants, but that's not what you do with Russian words, right? You have sometimes transliterated Russian words, sometimes sometimes written in Cyrillic, but always, but never distorted, always with a sensitivity and straight face, as it were. And I wonder how these words, why they're there and how they function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think maybe I should read a poem to illustrate, and we can kind of chat about it. I'm afraid we might have maybe 20 minutes left. Do we finish at 8? Just a minute. Yeah. So so that we can kind of get a taste for this. So this is a poem with an Easter egg. You know, I keep waiting for somebody to comment on this. I just decided this is the first time where I'm going to reveal the Easter egg. So this poem came really from language, from a phrase that was in my head for personal reasons, and it has to do with Maya Radist on page 44 in the book, which I then provided transcription and define in my own nerdy teacher-like way. So it has those two meanings of sweetheart, and then the literal meaning my joy, and the sort of Easter egg sort of thing that's going on here is, of course, in Russian we have gender for things such as joy that are inanimate, and the gender in Russian is feminine. So I keep waiting for somebody to say, is that a queer poem? Nobody asks, so there, it's a queer poem. I just queered it. So anyway, the more to the, the meaning of your question, but this is sort of like, there are these like little drawers with meanings. I think this ties in with what you're asking, because by providing the word in its original alphabet, which is not readable to anybody who doesn't read Russian, you're giving the visual. By providing a transcription, you're also giving them the oral. I'm being my very academic self, so that they can pronounce this. So in Latinx literatures in America, in particular in Chicano literature, with people like Gloria and Zaldúa, or today, Carla Cordero is a wonderful poet who grew up in the borderlands in California. So thinking about how Spanish can be, we can go from Spanish into English and English into Spanish, because that is what happens with these hybrid cultures and hybrid languages and ways of self-expression. We don't have that luxury with Russian. What do? I've had friends and colleagues stare at a page and say, this is wonderful that you mix languages, but I can't read any of the Russian, so I feel excluded. And I felt so bad for them. So the transcription is at least that gesture of inclusivity and inclusion, and an attempt at kind of reaching out of hand. Here, this is how we read this, without attempting to lecture too much. And I'm going to read the poem, and then I'll do a tiny bit more commenting on kind of the paradox, I think, of the meaning. So it's called Dressing a Memory. And the epigraph is, Maya Radist, sweetheart, literally, my joy, Russian. I can't picture you, sometime lover. You fold into memory with such skill and grace that I suspect it is what takes place between grown-ups. Well, these are child words. Maya Radist, a lantern on some other life. I still feel your sudden warmth. I still hear the sigh of language from the tiny seed that you planted. I want you in ridiculous Russian. I want you dressed only in that little expression which you made so sparklingly literal, and which is just sound splash to you. Ma-ya-ra. These are grunts or wailings, like the sounds of what your desire was. We made for each other this language without translation. So folks who are Russian speakers will notice, and perhaps folks who are not Russian speakers, if my attempt is noticeable, is that there's a very big difference between my joy and sweetheart. My joy can imply an erotic joy, a physical joy, a fleeting joy. A sweetheart is a more permanent relationship. And the poem struggles in between those two. I find it beautiful that words and idiomatic expressions can have very contradictory meanings. And my hope was to capture not just one word, as we would have to in translation, but both. And in the space of that, I got to tell a story. And that was fun. So That's an example.
Thank you for reading this. Shall we maybe open the floor to questions, and then perhaps leave the last few minutes, if you're willing, for another poem? Because among many other things that you do beautifully, you read them beautifully. And I think we want to hear how you read them. So let me ask the first question. The question says, out of curiosity, possibly an odd question, I do understand, but do you still think and dream in the mother tongue Russian, or has it switched to English like you're writing?
Yeah, and I was going to actually say that about this very poem, so that follows perfectly. Thank you for the wonderful question. Absolutely. So I do really, about half the time think in Russian in my head and dream in Russian, and yet I do feel a little bit excluded from it because our language of choice in my family is English, even though my partner is a fluent speaker. Just this is how life worked out. No offense and no regrets, but I miss it terribly, and so it wants out, and it feels very much just like mother's milk versus the acquired language is wonderful and sweet, and you can do all these fancy things with it and write sonnets and ghazals, but it feels sometimes like Coke, sweet and fizzy. The ideal marriage of the two would be very nice, but I'm still searching for that.
Thank you. Let's see if there are other questions. There don't seem to be other questions, so maybe this leaves us, gives us more opportunities to hear you read, and maybe questions will arrive as you're reading.
Yeah, I would be delighted. So this is the what I think of as a title poem, although it does not contain the title, but kind of ties in these themes of Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. And so I think it's worth a look. In translation. Translating a Life for Oksana Maksimchuk and Max Rosochinsky. Someone spread a blanket of wild buckwheat over a meadow. Someone tucked puffball pillows in each corner of the purple-green sheet. It is summer everywhere, except war. War where it used to be home, and now war by government here. And what does it matter that the meadow seduces the bees and pollen, or me in lines of a poem, or that I hear perfectly good Russian plant names for plants and translate them into you and me-ish. Take the tea mushroom, the little fox mushrooms and piggies, the early field dweller, the mysterious cheese eater. These words are undocumented here, and the country that sent them erases every syllable with its crimes. Take an under-birch mushroom anyway. It's a choice edible. Birch bolete in your tongue, on the tongue, the language for falling in love with forests and stories and friends does not care who's killing whom. Unfortunately, I care. And sitting here by a huge flowering bush, I see no refuge. What languaged fantasy could stop us from being murderous strangers? Would you take a Russian mushroom name, tuck it in your lapel for the brief banquet of life? Does that translate anything else for you? Is this how it works? I'm going to read one poem by Akhmatova and one response poem. So this book is structured as poems and translations and responses to the translated poems. And I owe the structure of this and the inspiration to Poets and Traders Press in Brooklyn, headed by Val Vanacore. There are wonderful books forthcoming and just out. There's one by Nina Kosman, translator and poet, and the poet she chose was close to Akhmatova's heart, and it's Tsvetaeva. Anna Akhmatova, translation. So actually, let me do a different poem by her so that I can demonstrate the kidnapped Akhmatova. Yeah. Okay. Anna Akhmatova, Northern Elegies 5. with an epigraph from the poet, 19th century poet Fyodor Tyutchev. Epigraph. Blessed be the man who visited this world during one of its fate-changing moments. Like a river, I was deflected by this bitter era. My life had been replaced. It ran inside another riverbed or past another, and I know nothing of these banks, my own. The spectacles that I was forced to miss, oh, how the curtain rose without me, fell the same way. All the friends, my own, I never met. The contours of the cities that could have made me cry, I saw none. I know one city in the whole world, and I can even find it in my sleep. So many poems I could have written, their secret chorus wandering around me. Someday it might just smother me. I've known the beginnings and the ends, and life after the end, and something that one should not recall these days. Some other woman took my one and only place, my name, the only legal name I had, and left my funny moniker to me that I'd used up for all it could lend me. I won't lie down into my own grave, alas. Yet sometimes, suddenly, the reckless wind of spring, a passage in a book I came across, a stranger's smile, any of this pulls me back into a lifetime that did not take place. In such and such year, that event would happen. In that year, plans to travel, watch and think, remembering, to enter a new love, like entering a mirror with the dull realization that infidelity happens, and that wrinkle which was not there just yesterday. Yet if I looked from there upon my present life, I could at last find out how envy feels. 1945, Leningrad. Response poem by me. Kidnapped Akhmatova. Anna, Anna, swaddled in your Hosanna-inducing scarf with its long tassels of sorrow, wake up, let me take you, the spectacles that I was forced to miss. You wrote futile letters begging for your friends to be released from labor camps. Oh, how the curtain rose without me, fell the same, let me take you, now that you are asleep and weightless. We'll go to the tender, tawdry Russia of the end of the 20th century, when all windows flew open. I think you'll like the show. I am 7, all scraped knees and elbows, Anna, Bobana, Bana, Fofana, Fana, etc. Let's have you be the same age as me. Look, right by my house, big, tall women wearing woven wristbands with multi-hued threads. They gave me one. They are called hippies. Guitars strummed in the ancient lane called Crooked Knee. Guitars leaned against the ancient church that still functions as a warehouse for potatoes. Anna, will you bend your knees in black chiffon? Will you sit with us in the glorious dust? Will you take a break from history? Look, Annabella, Russia is as whimsical as us. We both love swimming in the Black Sea. In the 1900s, they scold you, swimming is uncouth for a maiden. In the 1990s, I have an uncle as outpost in America. Check out my amazing leopard print bikini. Would you want this cheap paradise, Anna? Let's fly past the sea into the mountains. The tiny airplane is full of human sparrows who chirp at us in a language I've never heard. But I bet you have. They're French, my mother hisses me down the aisle. Stop staring. I am wearing a turquoise embroidered dress, the hard-to-find Chinese dress. Do you think it's the best dress ever, Anne? One birdie, smelling like a whole perfume shop, grabs at the hem of my dress, tweets about it with her friend. Am I real, Anna? Poetry in the 90s, you ask? Everywhere. Everything that was sensical flew open, became a peacock. Let's go to the Arbat. Look at the man on a street lamp post reciting his poetry. Look at the people afraid to be arrested for unsanctioned listening. Take a rest, Anna. Anna of Terse Life poems. I am 12 and fallen in crush with my American, gorgeous, pudgy teacher, John, walking up the hills of bloody, cracked Moscow. its car exhaust flecking his Doc Martens. Sit with me outside the school, Anya. Do you think he has read my love note? It's 3 hours after school. You and I are still girls. Like you, I have no right to what is most important. There is no break, Anna. Before I was pried away from that country by my well-meaning parents, before that country regained its appetite for blood, it had this moment. The underground club poetry read a novel out loud on a commuter train about a commuter train. The 1968 novel about a commuter train full of alcoholics, a patchwork of proletarianese and exquisite poetese, by the likes of you, Anna Andreevna, you fragrant person, making other people's lives impossible. They yearned for a past they wanted to recover. Did you live, Anna? The poets read that novel on the train where it was written, that train carrying drunks and memory. To Eden? Was that your train? Where did you go?
Well, maybe we have time for one or two more, because I don't want to sideline Gandelsman, and we could
Right.
a bit about him and your work translating his poetry and maybe your voice.
He's fantastic and not yet very well known, unlike Akhmatova. And so I should say a few words. So he was born in Leningrad, back then St. Petersburg now, in 1948, and has lived in the United States and also St. Petersburg since the early 90s. He's the author of, I believe, 18 poetry collections, some collected works. He has translated Macbeth into Russian, a really towering figure of kind of late modernism, late avant-garde. Akhmatova is not a super direct influence on him, but she's definitely of the world that really shaped him between Tsvetaeva and Pasternak. And he found himself in immigration, and so he's my patron saint of immigration in the book. I'm translating more of his work for a standalone poetry collection in English by him, and enjoying his work very, very much. So with translating him, I felt that I needed to make slightly different choices. With Akhmatova, there are a lot of rhymes that are what's called feminine, which is a terrible thing to say because, what is feminine, what is masculine, but, it's sort of like rhyming both syllables in exactly the same way, which in English often sounds artificial and a little stodgy, a little fake. If you rhyme ocean with emotion, right? So not so much. And with her, the musicality is so much of the rhythm. When we think of the way that she read, it was sort of in a trance, as if she's reading this way in a church liturgy. With Gandelsman, however, rhymes are really important because the lines are end stress, they are masculine rhymes, they're very loud, and there are slight fireworks that go off. So with that, and the lines are considerably shorter, so you really hear them. So with him, I went all out with trying to rhyme in English, and I like what we did. Let's see, with the help of Andrew Jenko, who was often my collaborator. The poem that you alluded to, Eleanor, is a wonderful one, and part of the reason why I like it is that it's so tragic comic. I mean, the way that it handles English is not unlike the way that, say, Eduard Limonov or Vasily Aksionov handles it, but to them it was like a serious, tragic journey into the United States, into alienation and whatnot. Here, there's simultaneously less and more going on because he uses so much self-irony and self-deprecation. And there is also so much that goes beyond the boundaries of immigrant alienation in the United States and is about existential despair and making fun of oneself as one goes through that. So these layers are just fabulous. It's such a rich poem, and it's called Immigrant Ditty. The sun goes down, the supermarket floods with dead light. Now the gate caws at you in the near darkness. A not so magic key might blaze. Can't steal happiness now, can you? Win Lotto America. Now this, as they call it, is a building. This is garbage. Nothing, this. Go ahead, open the door. Lean your heart against the wall. The world doesn't need you anymore. Bottom swimming, little fish. Fruit are morphing into veggies. It's the middle of the fall. Someone please come to my rescue. Let me breathe a little here. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. There goes a very average schmo. It's off to sleep, he waddles off on his short, well-trodden path. Is that some Carmen being stabbed at this late hour, I hear? Or the howl of the barked pooches sniffing out their little thieves? It's an envelope, its torn edge, the edge of a land not settled by you. It's the echoes of dumb music brought to you by Puerto Ricans. Poet sleep, it's you who's awful. Sing your fearsome bedtime songs. Lull your fear of balding. Autumn, darkly bronzed in the Bronx woods. It's the 50-50 birdie tweeting all alone at dawn. It's the elevator riding lifeless yellow afternoon. Demons swirl the rags of plastic bags around the street all day. Life is finite, death undying, a brain trembling. This is air. I love his work. Here's a very different Gandelsman, and that brings back the leitmotif that you were raising about children and peace, the profound peace of childhood, the profound certainty of childhood as expressed in this poem, without a title. A child is sleeping, one hand under her cheek, the other hugging a doll. She is not dreaming of guilt. She is profoundly right. Like a deep layer of snow, asleep in an empty yard. No factories nearby, no dark figures knee-deep in mud. The snow in the empty yard is like the child asleep, consisting radiantly only of itself. May we all be so sure of ourselves in our dreams.
This is lovely. Thank you. We had a comment. And I'm afraid the person who commented, Vera Dragic, has signed off. But she wanted to say that seeking roots and the pain associated with that, when not many in one's current culture can relate to that. Thank you, intense, so much resonated. Lovely academic and non-academic expressions of personal journeys that continue forward from ancestry left behind, that has been carried forward and cannot or should not be left behind, regardless of the pain. And the importance of carrying it forward to newer generations and to learn for a better future. And I wish she hadn't signed off quite yet. So,
oh goodness, thank you, Vera. Even though you're no longer with us, I will have to copy and paste this somewhere so that I can cherish it.
Yes, I actually have.
Oh,
and I will send it to you. So, and I think it's a very apt way for us to both hopeful and at the same time recognizing of the difficulties and challenges, an apt way for us to conclude.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. You've been a wonderful interlocutor. Couldn't have wished for a better discussion, really. Such an informed.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
Questions.
And a very interesting conversation and beautiful readings. I'm glad we asked you, and I'm glad you read, because there is something to be said for reading, listening to poetry as opposed to reading it with your eyes.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the attendees. Thank you for participating in the discussion.
Yeah, I will.
Being with us.
Yes, I will add a thanks especially to Eleanor and Olga for a lovely evening, especially Olga for lovely readings. It was wonderful. And with that, though, I will say goodbye to everyone, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their evening. And we'll give you one. There's a last call for book drawing, so I will extend my goodbye for 1 or 2 seconds before we say goodbye. And I hope again, everyone has a good evening. And again, thank you both to Olga and Eleanor for a really lovely conversation and lovely readings. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.